Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Martin Rees, the President of the Royal Society, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening. Before saying anything else, a rather dull routine request. Please can you turn off your mobile phones? I say this not only because of the live audience here, but because this lecture is being videoed and web streamed, and there may be an audience viewing it away from this lecture room. This lecture is part of a series sponsored by the John Templeton Foundation on general issues relating to the nature of human knowledge and understanding. And it's a great pleasure to welcome this evening's lecturer, Ziauddin Sardar, who is a writer, broadcaster, and cultural critic, although he started out as a humble journalist working for both Nature and New Scientist. He's currently an honorary visiting professor at the City University of London. And he's written extensively on Islam, science, and cultural issues. Indeed, he's published over 40 books. And among these is an autobiography called Desperately Seeking Paradise, Journeys of a Skeptical Muslim. He's also got a recent film for the BBC called Battling for Islam, which received wide acclaim. He's the editor of a journal called Futures, which deals with policy, planning, and future studies, and he still writes a column in the New Statesman. His lecture title this evening is Islam and Science, Beyond the Troubled Relationship. It's my great pleasure to introduce Ziauddin Sardar.
Thank you very much, Lord Rees. It's a great pleasure to be in this august institution. Ladies and gentlemen, at the end of the 10th century, a brilliant scientist left his hometown of Basra to pursue an ambitious project in Egypt. He had noticed how, seasonally, the river Nile flooded large parts of the delta, but in winter, water levels fell so low, cultivation was almost impossible. What, he thought, if the surplus flood water could be stored and used when most needed? He devised a scheme to regulate the Nile so that the people could derive benefit at its ebb and flow. His plan required building a three-way embankment dam near Aswan. He sent the proposal to the Fatimid Caliph Al-Hakim in Cairo. The Caliph was impressed and issued a royal commission. Come to Cairo and build the dam. The young scientist spent several months examining the site, working out the details of how to implement his plans, and it has to be said, spending the generous largesse of the Caliph. But there was a problem. The technology at his disposal was just not up to the task. He came to a sad conclusion. If it were possible to dam the Nile, the ancient Egyptians would already have done so. Now he faced a new problem: how to tell the Caliph. He devised his most cunning plan. He pretended to be mad. The Caliph retired him to a small office near Alhazen University. The young scientist was Ibn al-Haytham, known to the West as Alhazen. This pretend madman spent the next 2 decades in his laboratory in Cairo, where he developed and refined the techniques of experimental method, worked on spherical and parabolic mirrors, spherical aberration, the magnifying power of lenses, and atmospheric refraction. He noted how rays of light originate in the object seen and not in the eye, as commonly believed by the Greeks, and correctly explained the apparent increase in size of the sun and the moon when near the horizon. He formulated the laws of reflection and refraction and proclaimed experimental and empirical evidence the foundation of all scientific work. According to historian George Sarton, Ibn Haytham is one of the greatest students of optics of all times. He wrote over 200 books on astronomy, mathematics, physics, and philosophy. His greatest achievement, Kitab al-Manazir, translated into Latin in the late 13th century as the Book of Optics, was the first comprehensive treatment of the subject. It influenced Roger Bacon and Kepler and had a major impact on Western science. Over 1,000 years later, when technology finally made an Aswan Dam possible, another brilliant scientist left his native city, Lahore, to implement his scientific plans. Already he had a PhD from Cambridge. Now he wanted to establish a research group in theoretical physics at Punjab University, where he was professor of mathematics. But his dreams were frustrated. No official support, no journals, no funds to attend conferences. The nearest physicist was in Bombay, by now a city in another country. The head of his institution advised, forget about physics, and offered him a choice of 3 jobs: bursar, warden of Hall of Residence, or president of the football club. He chose the football club. Later, he wrote movingly of the tragic dilemma he faced, physics or Pakistan. And happily, he left Pakistan and returned to Cambridge. His name was Abdul Salam. His passion for physics led him to work on particle symmetries, gauge theories, and the 2-component theory of the neutrino. For his work on the theory of unified weak and electromagnetic interaction between elementary particles, he shared the 1979 Nobel Prize for Physics with Steven Weinberg and Sheldon Glashow. Ladies and gentlemen, the eras of Salam and Alhazen could not have been more different. Alhazen flourished in a civilization which valued scientific enterprise. Salam, the product of a society where science was conspicuously absent. What happened in the 1,000 years separating these two Muslim physicists is a subject of intense study, conjecture, and controversy. My purpose tonight is to explore these issues and suggest why conventional explanations are both unsatisfactory and totally fail to indicate potential remedies, the kind that would restore the enterprise of science in Muslim societies. 2 things can be stated with some certainty. 1, science thrived during the classical period of Islam. 2, science in Muslim societies today is conspicuous by its absence. The difficulties arise in trying to ascertain when the decline began and what the causes were. Historians of science offer different dates and varied reasons. The most common stance is simply to blame Islam itself. There is something in the teachings of Islam, the argument goes, which does not allow science to take roots in Muslim societies. This suggestion not only belies history, but also the basic teachings of Islam, which proclaims itself as an intrinsically rational worldview. Both Salam and Alhazen were inspired by the spirit of the Quran. Alhazen wrote not only philosophical, but religious treatises. He made 2 Quranic verses, one stating believers should urge one another to truth, the other that truth claims should be tested, the basis of his scientific work. He wrote, truth is sought for its own sake, but finding the truth is difficult and the road to it is rough. Science, he suggested, should be based on severe criticism, and the claims of scientists themselves should be put to critical tests. He continued, God has not preserved the scientists from error and has not safeguarded science from shortcomings and faults. A person who studies scientific books with the view of knowing the truth ought to turn himself into a hostile critic of everything that he studies. He should criticize it from every point of view and in all its aspects. And while thus engaged in criticism, he should also be suspicious of himself and not allow himself to be easygoing and indulgent with regard to the object of his criticism. If he takes this course, the truth will be revealed to him, and the flaws in the writings of his predecessors will stand out clearly. Salam, too, repeatedly emphasized his work took his inspiration from the Quran. In his banquet speech at the Nobel Prize ceremony, Salam quoted the verse, Do you see in the creation of the All-Merciful any imperfection? Return your gaze. You see any fissure, then return your gaze again and again. Your gaze comes back to you, dazzled, aweary. This, he suggested, describes the faith of all physicists. The deeper we seek, the more is our wonder excited, the more is the dazzlement of our gaze. Salam selected just one of around 800 verses in the Quran that invite the reader to think, reflect, examine, and study the material world and use reason as a sign to understand nature. The most quoted verse reads, "There are signs in the heavens and the earth for those who believe in the creation of you, in the creatures God scattered on earth. There are signs for the believers. There are signs for people of sure faith, in the alternation of night and day, in the rain God provides, sending it down from the sky and reviving the dead earth with it, and in the shifting of winds. There are signs for those who use their reason." The sayings of Prophet Muhammad reinforce these teachings, emphasizing understanding comes through scientific endeavor. "An hour's study of nature is better than a year's prayer," the Prophet declared. He directed his followers to listen to the words of the scientists and instill into others the lessons of science. In his time, China was considered a far-off but scientifically advanced civilization. So he urged his followers to go in quest of knowledge even to China. And the Prophet made the essential distinction. The revealed book, as well as his own teachings, were exhortations, an invitation to reason and study what exists and can be discovered, not scientific pronouncements in and of themselves. The teachings of Islam are the same now as they were 1,000 years ago. Islam was not a problem then. It is not the problem now. Islam was there when science flourished. Islam remained while science, learning, knowledge, and creativity declined to their present perilous state. So what happened? Perhaps if we fixed a date, identified the tipping point, we could pinpoint what provoked the downward spiral. But dating the decline has become controversial. J.D. Bernal, famous historian of science, argues the decline began in the 11th century, after which the last days of Islamic science were over. So for Bernal, the story of Islamic science is short and sharp. Colin Ronan is a bit more generous. He places the final stages of Islamic science as beginning in the 12th century. George Sarton shifts the boundary even further to the second half of the 14th century. In his monumental survey of the history of science, Sarton assigns each half-century to a dominant intellectual personality. So in Sarton's reckoning, Islamic science begins in the second half of the 8th century, the time of Jabir ibn Hayyan, the father of chemistry. Before Al-Haytham's arrival, there was the time of Al-Khwarizmi, the inventor of algebra. Al-Razi, who infused medicine with clinical precision. Al-Masudi, the geographer who produced a map of the world towards the end of the 10th century. And Abul Wafa, the astronomer and mathematician who produced accurate trigonometric tables. Al-Haytham flourished during the 10th century, the time of Al-Biruni, the polymath who measured the longitude and latitude of notable cities and wrote a detailed account of the cultures of India. He was followed by Umar Khayyam, the mathematician who solved equations of third degrees and wrote poetry on the side. From here on, Western science begins its incursion. Accolades have to be shared. 3 giants dominate each half-century, only one of whom represents Muslim civilization. Though, one might add, the Jewish representatives were scientists born and educated and engaged in Muslim societies, which enabled them to be a major conduit for the transmission of knowledge to Christendom. The first half of the 12th century belongs to Ibn Zuhr, who perfected surgical and postmodern techniques. He shares the spotlight with William of Conches and Ibrahim ibn Ezra. They are followed by the celebrated rational philosopher Ibn Rushd, who shares the accolades with Jared of Karimona and Maimonides. The botanist Ibn al-Batir, whose Encyclopedia of Medical Plants is regarded as one of the greatest botanical compilation, shares the first half of the 13th century with Robert Grosseteste and Jacob Anatole. The age of Roger Bacon and Jacob ibn Taban is also the age of Qutbuddin al-Shirazi, the Sufi astronomer who continued the work of Al-Haytham and gave the first correct explanation of the formation of the rainbow. Next comes the age of Abul Fida, the astronomer and chronicle of human history, who gave his name to the crater on the moon and shares his half-century with Levi ben Garson and William of Ockham. Finally, we have the age of the historian and father of sociology, Ibn Khaldun, second half of the 14th century, shared with Geoffrey Chaucer and Hasdai Priscus. For Sarton, the enterprise of Islamic science ends here. Not so, says George Saliba, the historian of Islamic astronomy. He sees the 14th century not as an age of decline, but a golden age. Saliba regards the time from Nasruddin al-Tusi, who died in 1274, and Ibn al-Shatir, who died in 1375, two astronomers who worked at the Maraga Observatory in northwest Iran, as one of the most productive periods for theoretical astronomy. Indeed, Saliba suggests the Copernican revolution would not have been possible without the work carried out at Maraga, where the basic mathematical models of the heliocentric solar system, including the Tusi couple, were first developed. He shows in painstaking detail how Copernicus' models are not only identical to those of the Maraga astronomers, but they also replicate exactly the same notational mistakes. And the boundaries of decline keep getting pushed further forward in time. A collection of new research, edited by Abdul Salam, published in 2003, shows scientific activity in Muslim societies very much alive right to the end of the 17th century. Even the Ottoman Empire, most historians candidate for the era of endemic decline of Muslim civilization, turns out to be a rather fruitful period. The massive project on the scientific literature in the Ottoman period, carried out under Ekmaluddin Ehsanoglu in Istanbul, suggests science was alive right up to the 18th century, when the emphasis shifted to learning and assimilating European sciences through translations and adaptations. Exactly when the decline of Islamic science began is no obtuse question. It carries major implications. Placing it squarely in the early Middle Ages, historians of science effectively have sought to de-link Islamic science from modern science. If Islamic science was dead and gone by the 14th century, and, as David Lingberts puts it, little was left by the 15th century, lack of any connection to the emergence of modern science becomes a self-evident truth. Modern science emerges as an autonomous, self-propelling enterprise of Western civilization. But the facts, as recent research has shown, are otherwise. There is a continuum between Islamic science and Western science. Science in Islam is not just a forerunner, something strangely distinct and distant from science today, but an integral part of modern science. If science progresses by accumulation, by building on the works of previous generations, standing on the shoulders of the giants, then modern science would be inconceivable without Islamic science. Locating the decline firmly before the 15th century serves another purpose. It denies any connection to colonialism, a thorny issue thus safely ignored. Look as much as you like, and indeed I have diligently for years, and discussion of colonialism is conspicuously absent from this discourse. Yet colonialism, more than any other factor, played a major part in the suppression and eventual disappearance of science and learning from Muslim societies. Quite simply, the colonial encounter began with eager, voracious interest by Western nations in the science and technology of Muslim civilization, and a simultaneous insistence that all they found was decay and superstition. Once Islamic science was appropriated, colonial powers closed colleges and universities, banned research, and outlawed the practice of indigenous science and medicine. In the Maghreb, for example, the French not only banned the practice of Islamic medicine, but made practitioners liable for capital punishment. In Indonesia, the Dutch closed Muslim institutions and prohibited Muslims enrolling in centers of higher learning right up to 1952. Historians of science preempt such considerations. Bernal suggests the 11th century saw, quote, a general political and economic decay of Islam in its original form, which led to the absence of a widely based and living environment for science. Matters were further aggravated by the Mongol invasion and the sacking of Baghdad in 1258. But the Mongol invasion compares poorly with what happened under colonialism. If you take all agency from a society, define and describe its science and learning as insignificant, irrelevant, and pre-modern, and deny all access to any form of intellectual endeavor, except that which produces servants of colonial administration, it is not surprising indigenous science disappears from that society. The other form of preemption is the marginality thesis of Islamic science. It has been used by numerous historians to suggest scientific activity in Muslim civilization. To quote Abdul Salam, had no significant impact on the social, economic, educational, and religious institutions, that this activity remained itself unaffected by these institutions, except when it was finally crushed by their antagonism or indifference, and that those who kept the Greek legacy alive in Islamic lands constituted a small group of scholars who had little to do with the spiritual life of the majority of Muslims, who made no important contribution to the main contents of Islamic intellectual life, and whose work and interests were marginal to the central concerns of Islamic society. A natural product of this thesis is the implication most Muslim scientists, such as Alhazen and Al-Bruni, were in fact secularists. For example, Tobihov suggests their work did not have an Islamic subscript attached to it, for it represented transcendent, transnational, transcultural accomplishments. Indeed, in as far as their work was hard science, it naturally represented universal knowledge applicable in all cultures. The same is invariably said of the work of Isaac Newton, so long as one ignores the years of effort and study he spent obsessed with biblical chronology. When we speak of Muslim scientists in the classical era, we are talking about men who lived before the age of secularism. The separation of the sacred and the profane was beyond their wildest imagination. They were all, even the most unorthodox, Muslims first and anything else second. The basis of their education was common to the doctors of science and doctors of law and theology, and many contributed in all these disciplines. The point is, by virtue of their education, those who became scientists were grounded in the conceptual framework of Islamic ideas. It gave a distinctive character to their way of thinking, understanding how they conceived of and represented the result of their study. There is a characteristic temper to their scholarship. We find it most often in the conclusions of their work. It is far more than mere convention. It is far more than mere convention that the normal way to conclude any argument is the phrase, "God alone knows all." The phrase defines an approach to knowledge imbued with humility and a horror of arrogance. It betokens a healthy respect for the other side of the equation of learning, ignorance. It is the hallmark of the Islamic worldview and a perpetual engine of the critical scientific outlook. Not only were scientists of the classic era not hiding behind the masks of a value-free pursuit of knowledge, but like Ibn Haytham and Salam, insisted their inspiration came from Islam. And like Haytham and Salam, they were also humanists. As George Makdisi demonstrates so powerfully, humanism, as we understand it today, began in Islam. Indeed, their humanism was a product of their Islamic commitment. The Islamic subscript is everywhere. The pursuit of science for them is a form of worship, a religious injunction. To suggest Muslim scientists was social aberration, covert secularists, is to project modernist obsession onto history, a sort of post-de facto rationalization. A more elaborate theory of the decline of Islamic science focuses on internal disputes between rational and conservative schools of thought, a dispute which took shape at the end of the 8th century when seats of Khilafat moved from Damascus to Baghdad and when most of the greatest names in Islamic science were as yet unborn. Lindsberg, for example, suggests Islamic science began to decline when conservative religious forces made themselves increasingly felt. Sometimes it took the form of outright opposition to science. More often, the effect was subtler. Not the extinction of scientific activity, but the alteration of its character by the imposition of a very narrow definition of utility. The so-called conservative forces were led by a group of scholastic philosophers known as the Ash'arites. Pitted against them, goes the theory, was a group of rationalist philosophers known as the Mu'tazilites. The fate of Islamic science was sealed with the victory of Ash'arites over the Mu'tazilites. Here's how Ronan presents their encounter. Islam extols the value of revelation above all else. This is not to say that reason is discredited, far from it. The use of human intellect is prized as one of God's gifts, but it must be forever under the control of revelation. The Mu'tazilites, who emerged about 700, were aware of this. Indeed, they set such a store by reason that they said it could fathom even the deepest profundities of religious belief. On the other hand, the Ash'arites, whose views first appeared a couple of centuries later, condemned the overzealous use of reason and its adulteration of religious dogma. And for nearly 2 centuries, the rival schools wrangled with each other until during the 12th century, the Ash'arite argument carried the day. They then developed the attitude of passive acceptance. This attitude was inevitably inimical to independent scientific thinking, as intellectual traditionalism won the day. Islam never separated religion and science into watertight compartments as we do now, and the torch of science had to be carried by others. Some scholars go so far as pointing to one individual Asharite as the sole cause of the decline of Islamic science, the 12th century writer and theologian Al-Ghazali. Excuse me. There are numerous problems with this flawed, simplistic analysis. If the division between rationalists and conservatives were clear-cut, then we would expect an exact scientist of Al-Haytham's caliber to be a Mu'tazilite. In fact, he was an Asharite, as were many other scientists. The truth is, Asharites were just as rationalist as the Mu'tazilites. The Mu'tazilites were just as religious, or if you like, conservative, as the Asharites. And both used philosophic methods, reason and logic, to argue their case. The religious nature of Mu'tazilite thought is clear from Ibn Sina's theory of human knowledge, which, following Al-Farabi, transfers the Quranic scheme of revelation to Greek philosophy. In the Quran, the Creator addresses one man, the Prophet, through the agency of the Archangel Gabriel. In Ibn Sina's Neoplatonic scheme, the divine word is transmitted through reason and understanding to any and every person who cares to listen. The result is an amalgam of rationalism and Islamic ethics. For Muslim scholars and scientists who, like Ibn Sina, subscribe to philosophy of Mu'tazalism, values are objective and good and evil are descriptive characteristics of reality, no less there in things than their other qualities, such as shape and size. In this framework, all knowledge, including the knowledge of God, can be acquired by reason alone. Humanity has power to know as well as to act, and is thus responsible for its just and unjust actions. What this philosophy entailed, both in terms of the study of nature and shaping human behavior, was illustrated by Ibn Tufayl in his intellectual novel, Life of Wahi, published in the 12th century. Wahi is a spontaneously generated human isolated on an island. Through his power of observation and the use of his intellect, he discovers general and particular facts about the structure of the material and spiritual universe, deduces the existence of God, and develops a rationally satisfying theological system. Contrary to common misunderstandings, both schools agreed on the rational study of nature. They had to. The Quran dictated that it should be so. In his Al-Tamid, Abu Bakr al-Baklani, the theologian credited with producing the first systematic statement of Asharite doctrine, defines science as the knowledge of the object as it really is. While reacting to the Mu'tazilite position on Greek philosophy, the Asharite conceded the need for objective and systematic study of nature. Indeed, this is why some of the greatest scientists in Islam, such as Al-Biruni and Fakhruddin al-Razi, were supporters of Asharite theology. The concern of both sides was the delineation of truth. As the Asharite Al-Biruni declared, do not shun the truth from whatever source it comes. Ghazali went even further. He told his students, if scientific discourse consisted of only that kind of material which causes you to have doubt about the beliefs instilled into you since childhood, so that you are stimulated towards study and research, then that would be a very satisfactory result. For doubt leads to truth. Whosoever has no doubt of any kind does not reflect, and who does not reflect cannot see clearly. And he who cannot see clearly remains in a state of blindness and in error. So what constituted the dispute? It had two aspects. First, they disagreed on the best way to attain rational truth. For the Mu'tazilites, general and universal questions came first and then led to experimental work. This is why Ibn Sina starts his Canons of Medicine, which remained a standard text in the West till the 18th century, with a general discussion on the theory of drugs. But for the Asharites, universal come out of practical experimental work. Theories are formulated after discoveries. Al-Biruni begins his determination of the coordinates of the cities by describing his experiments before drawing general theoretical conclusions. Second, what are the limits to rational inquiry? For the Mu'tazilites, there were no limits. The Asharites were concerned about instrumental rationality. When Al-Ghazali talks about blameworthy knowledge, he is raising issues of a classical version of the precautionary principle. Should we make poison simply because we can? Is a system of thought that has all the paraphernalia of a discipline necessarily good for society? The example he gives is astrology. Now, these issues are still with us today, and they have been debated by scientists and philosophers for centuries. Such discussions never thwarted the development of modern science. Why should we assume it did in the classical period of Islamic civilization? The victory of the Ash'arites thought had nothing to do with the decline of Islamic science. On the contrary, both sides were eager to promote thought and learning. It is also worth noting, neither the Mu'tazilites nor the Ash'arites regarded scientific method as the only means of rational inquiry. Most Muslim scientists tended to be polemists. It seemed to be the general rule in the classical period. This is testimony to the homogeneity of the Islamic philosophy of science and its emphasis on synthesis, interdisciplinary investigation, and multiplicity of methods. Even a strong believer in mathematical realism, such as al-Biruni, argued the method of inquiry was a function of the specific nature of investigation. Different methods, all equally varied, were required to answer different types of questions. Al-Biruni himself had used several methods. In his treatise on mineralogy, he is the most exact of experimental scientists. But in the introduction to his groundbreaking study of India, he declares, to execute our project, it has not been possible to follow the geometric method. He therefore resorts to comparative sociology. In his treatise devoted to the question of shadows, he differentiates between mathematical and philosophical method. Methodological differences often generated debates and controversies, but to suggest that such debates or the victory of one over another led to the decline of Islamic science is simply naive. We have to look elsewhere for the genuine causes of decline. Both as a faith and culture, Islam is a conceptual worldview. Muslims are fond of describing Islam as a total way of life. What they mean is that the holistic worldview of Islam integrates all aspects of reality through a moral perspective. This perspective is provided by a framework of conceptual values within which Muslims endeavor to answer human problems. Concepts such as ilm, knowledge, ijma, consensus, and istislah, public interest, are the driving force of Muslim society. Ilm, the urge to know, or ijtihad, the quest for sustained reasoning, for example, were the central driving forces of classical Islam and produced a culture with science and rationality as its core. The problem we seek to explain is how this central driving force is putted to a halt. I would argue the decline of science in Muslim societies is a product of the systematic reduction in the meaning of the basic concepts of Islam. This process not only reduced Islam from a holistic worldview to a one-dimensional faith, but also truncated the creativity of Muslim societies. If Muslim society is like a human body, an analogy once used by the Prophet Muhammad, then this process of reduction has taken the mind from the body. What is left is living and functioning, but without the brain. As a consequence, science and rationality have almost evaporated in contemporary Islamic culture. Again, there is a conventional explanation for this process. Studies endlessly refer to the point in time when the gates of ijtihad were closed, but the use of ijtihad, or sustained reasoning, was never actually banned. As recent research has shown, the gates were never firmly closed. The shutters came down only slowly. And the process was more complex than simply the pronouncement of a few religious scholars. Their dictates were always disputed. The very idea was taken to task by every Muslim reform movement to emerge from that day to this. So what is missing from the analysis? What prevents us detecting how and why the enterprise of Islamic science deserted Muslim society? I have argued for the intimate and constructive connection between Islam and science. But Islamic science did not only have a conceptual religious context, it also had a social context. Islamic science operated within a social, political, economic, and institutional metric. Science begat technology, and technology served a thriving economy. Wealth creation provided the resources to invest in the infrastructure of educational and research institutions, the universities, libraries, teaching hospitals, observatories, and the like, that produced yet more scientists. And as every working scientist today knows, when the economy suffers, when economic enterprise declines, Research and development budgets are cut, grants disappear, even whole departments are axed, standards drop, and the brains drain away to the new centers of economic power if they can. History is not such a foreign country after all. In history, as now, science was integral to the development of society. In Muslim society, it fed the growth of industries. The studies of mineralogy, advances in chemistry, study of botany and hydraulics all had application relevant to the productive capacity of society. In agriculture, an agricultural revolution supported by the study of agronomy, hydrology, geological studies raised living standards and created wealth. The legacy of these developments is still benefiting Spain today. The study of astronomy, development of compasses and observational instruments, the study of geography and map-making all promoted and facilitated long-distance trade. Muslim civilization, wherever it spread, was a city-building culture. Architecture, city planning and land management, provision of clean water and sewage disposal all benefited from the application of science. The great scientists of the classical era all contributed directly or indirectly to this social context. It was a context shaped by the institution of Islam which ensured that science prospered and served society. One of the pillars of Islam is zakat, the annual payment required of all Muslims and dedicated to social purposes, such as education, health provision, and the eradication of poverty. Giving in charity is a religious injunction that created a social institution called waqf, perpetual charitable endowments, which again funded projects such as hospitals, universities, and research establishments. And of course, the state was a major sponsor, patron and consumer of science for a multitude of purposes, from city building to the technology of warfare. Science never emerges in a vacuum. It always has a culture context. It is fed and shaped by the conditions of its time and place. If the Muslim world had not been such a vibrant, dominant, growing concern in the 15th century, Europe would have had no need to subvert its power. What is termed the age of exploration was a deliberate strategy diligently pursued by various European nations. It was designed to circumvent what they regarded as Muslim stranglehold on the economy, a stranglehold that was maintained by Islamic science. Investment in explorations gave a new impetus to the development of science in Europe itself, and it generated the process termed colonialism. Colonialism produced two outcomes in Muslim civilization. First, it suppressed and displaced the scientific culture of Muslim society. It did this by introducing new systems of administration, law, education, and economy, all of which were designed to instill dependence, compliance, and subservience to colonial powers. The decline of Islamic science is one aspect of the general economic and political decay and deterioration of Muslim society that resulted. Islam as a holistic way of life became mere rhetoric. Islamic education became a cul-de-sac, a one-way ticket to marginality. What relevance could such education have when its concepts and principles had no practical meaning for how society operated? Nor was the modern education offered by the colonial powers a path to success. The function of this education was to ensure that colonial subjects served the needs and vested interests of the colonial order. Western education ruled, but it taught the colonized to accept a distorted version of their own history as backward, their own science as irrelevant, their own medicine as nothing but mumbo-jumbo. The colonized were pre-modern. The society believes in ideas deficient and incapable of generating their own modernity and progress. The dismissal of Islamic science as real science went hand in hand with the dismissal of the entire conceptual order of Islam as religion, culture, and civilization. Second, colonialism generated a further impulse for the conceptual reduction of Muslim civilization. Islam was reduced to a defensive enclave of resistance, stubbornly holding on to the few remnants of authority left to indigenous control. Colonialism turned the problem of authenticity and authority, a problem of conceptual meaning, into the central debate for Muslims. The debate started with the question, who is a scholar? Whose thought, research, and opinion are worthy of social and cultural attention? Just who is an alim, the technical term for a scholar? And what makes him an authority? In classical Islam, an alim was anyone who acquired ilm, or knowledge, which was itself described in a broad sense. We can see this in the early classifications of knowledge by such scholars as Al-Kandi, Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, Al-Ghazali, and Ibn Khaldun. Indeed, both the definition of knowledge and its classification was a major intellectual activity in classical Islam. Knowledge meant everything from science and philosophy to art, literature and theology. So all learned men, scientists as well as philosophers, scholars as well as theologians, constituted the ulama, the body of the learned. But as ijtihad became increasingly irrelevant, ilm was increasingly reduced to religious knowledge, and the ulama came to constitute only religious scholars. So from an Islamic point of view, only the pursuit of religious education came to be seen as important. Similarly, the idea of ijma, the central notion of communal life in Islam, has been reduced to the consensus of a select few. Ijma literally means consensus of the people. The concept dates back to the practice of Prophet Muhammad, leader of the original polity of Muslims. When the Prophet Muhammad wanted to reach a decision, he would call the whole Muslim community, then admittedly not very large, to the mosque. A discussion would ensue. Arguments for and against would be presented. Finally, the entire gathering would reach a consensus. Thus, a democratic spirit was central to communal and political life in early Islam. But the notion of ijma also performed another function. It located authority in argument. If ilm was intended to spread all varieties of knowledge throughout society, then the majority of citizens would be members of a learned community. The consensus of the community would therefore be a learned consensus arrived on the basis of argument. But the process of reduction removed knowledgeable citizens from the equation. Ijma was truncated to the consensus of the religious scholars. Thus, both democracy and the pursuit of knowledge as a whole were rendered irrelevant to Muslim culture. Other key elements of the conceptual framework of Islam were similarly reduced. Jihad ceased to be intellectual struggle and cultural development and was abridged to warfare. Istislah, normally rendered as public interest and a major source of Islamic law and an important impulse for science in the classical period, all but disappeared from Muslim consciousness. And ijtihad came to mean little more than a pious desire. Thus, the question how Muslim societies can rediscover the spirit of scientific inquiry is not just a question of policy, or funding, or building prestigious institutions in the name of progress. Most importantly, it is about how the enterprise of science is made relevant and meaningful, internalized within the ethos and conceptual framework of Muslim societies. Thus, the decline of Islamic science was a product of combined forces that engineered a conceptual reduction in Muslim society, Muslim civilization. My proposition is clear. The decline can only be reversed by effecting a conceptual shift. Science will only take root in Muslim societies if they can reorient themselves, reconceptualize Islam itself as a holistic enterprise. Science will flourish, paradoxical as this may seem to many of you, when Islam re-emerges as an integrative way of knowing, being, and doing, when it reconnects and reconstructs the open intellectual climate and cultural paradigm it once sustained. When in 1980 I initiated the contemporary debate on Islamic science, first in the pages of Nature and then New Scientist, I was not fully aware of the power of the reductive concepts on Muslim societies. By science, I meant and understood an objective and systematic endeavor, much like the work of Alhazen and Salam, which was motivated by Islamic injunctions on the virtues of reason and pursuit of knowledge. I turned out to be totally wrong. The debate itself was reduced to two components. The first derives from the fundamentalist idea, all knowledge, including scientific knowledge, can be found in the Quran. This is another step in reduction of the concept of ilm, to not just religious knowledge, but only that which can be found in the pages of the Quran. Backed by a lavishly funded Saudi project, Scientific Miracles in the Quran, this tendency has spotted a whole genre of apologetic literature, books, papers, journals, looking at scientific content of the Quran. From relativity, quantum mechanics, Big Bang theory, to the entire field of embryology, and much of modern geology has been discovered in the Quran. Meanwhile, scientific experiments have been devised to discover what is mentioned in the Quran but not known to science. For example, the program to harness the energy of jinns enjoyed much support in the mid-90s in Pakistan. This reductive fundamentalism now embraces creationism and is generating a growing movement of for intelligence design in the Muslim world. There is a profound irony here. Classical Muslim scientists, such as Ibn Tufail, who I have already mentioned, the author of Life of Wahi, and Ibn Nafis, who discovered the circulation of blood, leaned heavily towards evolution. The Quran insists Adam was the first prophet and not the first man. It invites the reader to discover a rational explanation of how humanity came to be on this planet. Yet, unfortunately, the fundamentalist version of science and its association with creationism is the most popular notion of Islamic science in the Muslim world today. The second component is best described as mystical fundamentalism. In this version, the consensus, the ijma of a knowledgeable community, is further reduced to a group of mystics with secret and sacred scientific knowledge. In this perspective, Islamic science becomes an ontological study of the nature of things. The material universe is studied as an integral and subordinate part of higher levels of existence, consciousness, and modes of knowing. Thus, science is not a problem-solving enterprise and socially objective inquiry. It is a mystical quest for understanding of the absolute. In this universe, conjecture and hypothesis have no place. All inquiry must be subordinate to mystical experience. Even the history of Islamic science has been rewritten. Proponents of this position emphasize the occult, alchemy, and astrology at the expense of the vast amount of work in exact sciences in an attempt to show Islamic science was largely sacred science. In many academic circles, this mystical tendency has acquired a strong presence. These two trends, the fundamentalist and the mystical, suggest that real science has almost evaporated from Muslim consciousness. In a recent survey, Nature reported, today's Muslim states barely register on indices of research spending, patents, and publications. And it concludes, the situation is not just bad, it is set to get worse. However, I think we need not be so pessimistic. The solution to any problem begins with a diagnosis. My optimism is based on the fact that diagnosis has already begun. Increasingly, the realization is growing that science is important, not just for the prosperity of Muslim societies, not just for the purpose of economic development, or for misplaced political vanity, or notions of defense based on acquiring nuclear weapons, but that science matters because it is vital for the recovery and survival of Islam itself. Just as the spirit of Islam in history was defined by scientific enterprise, so the future of Muslim societies will depend on their relationship to science and learning. This is the main message of the Arab Human Development Report of 2003. This groundbreaking report on building a knowledge society frankly admits Muslims cannot merely continue to blame everything on the West. Muslim states have failed by their own Islamic standards, the challenge of independence. The report blames authoritarian thought, lack of autonomy in universities, the sorry state of libraries and laboratories, and underfunding in the Arab world. Moreover, the report recognizes the conceptual problems of interpretation and declares time has come to proclaim those positive religious texts that cope with current realities. In particular, it calls for reviving ijtihad as the driving force for change. Indeed, it is now widely argued science can play an important part, not just in re-establishing ijtihad, but in making Islam whole again, reuniting reason again with revelation. Thus, the revival of science and a reform agenda for Islam in Muslim society need to proceed hand in hand. This is the course the Organization of Islamic Conference has set itself. It helps that the 57-member Intergovernmental Organization of Muslim States recently elected Ekmaluddin Hasanoglu, former president of the International Union for the History and Philosophy of Science, as its Secretary General. Hasanoglu has initiated a process aiming to secure greater expenditure on R&D in Muslim countries over the coming decades. Inatahur Rahman, Pakistan's Minister of Higher Education, who recently became Fellow of the Royal Society, Hasanoglu has a like-minded soul for whom the status quo simply will not do. It is to be hoped they can make a formidable partnership, using not merely their key institutional positions, but their conceptual insight on the nature of the problem to stimulate, nurture, and promote genuine change, the kind that will initiate wide-ranging reform. Other signs of change can be detected in religious institutions. The Alhazen University in Cairo, one of the most influential institutions of the Muslim world, for example, has now opened up to science. Its history reflects the reductive course of Muslim society, abandoning science as it became merely a religious institution concentrating on theology. Now it is rebalancing its curricula, emphasizing science as much as religion. Religious classes are making way for laboratories and courses in science. No one should be in any doubt. Muslims have a deep emotional attachment to their scientific heritage. But contemporary Muslim society needs more than nostalgic pride in a long-departed golden age. Instead of cherishing the ashes of a burnt-out fire, they need to transmit its flame. Rekindling the flame must mean more than simply eulogizing a list of achievements. It has to focus on instilling the way of thinking, the critical consciousness and methodologies that made Islamic science possible. And it must make this way of thinking and knowing relevant to contemporary times. As both Alhazen and Salam discovered and knew so well, there are no quick fixes in science. There is no substitute for hard labor in the laboratory. Yet they were sure of the source of their inspiration, used it to persist in their work, and never lost sight of how it encouraged them to be critical and innovative scientists. There is every reason to hope that remaking such connections can reignite science in Muslim societies as a going concern for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The speaker has agreed to answer questions, and we have 10 or 15 minutes. So could I say that if you want to ask a question, please wait till the microphone reaches you, stand up and give your name, and then ask your question. Yes, well, let's start off here. Yes.
Angela Franklin. Thank you very much. That was very interesting, very good to hear. I wonder if you could say, though, you have explained how you want, if you like, a reliving of the flourishing of science and religion and a holistic view of Islam. Well, at the time when science was flourishing in Islam, so too were all the Western scientists and theologians and philosophers were also all Christian. So what do you say or expect to have to say to the more fundamentalist, conservative Islamists now when they look at the West and they see only too much there seems to be a very distinct religious Christian lot on one side, and it isn't the case, but lots of people on the other side who are science and religion don't mix, and certainly we have plenty of secular scientists and many atheists. And may they not justifiably fear that that will happen too now in the Islamic world?
Well, I mean, society consists of lots of different people. In any human society, you will get all shades of opinions from one extreme to another extreme. I think with the conservative forces, we need to argue that they have a very reduced notion of Islam and of how an Islamic society should function. I think that's the argument I'm presenting, that Islam seems to be, conceptually, to be reduced more and more and becoming more and more fundamentalist. Now, if you really want science to flourish in a society like that, then you need a different notion of Islam. You need to reconceptualize Islam. So instead of going down and down in a reductive way, it comes up and becomes more holistic. Now, the idea of having secularists and atheists doesn't bother me. I mean, many scientists are religious, have religious orientation. Some don't have. Some are atheists, some are Catholics, some are Muslims. I think that if you look at the history of science in Islam, we have all shades of opinions. So that doesn't really worry me. But if we are talking about how Muslim societies themselves can do something about science, then my argument is that they can only do that if they reconceptualize Islam itself. just by concentrating on science and doing a little bit here is not going to solve the problem. I mean, Saudi Arabia is a very good example where endless funding was available, but science did not take root in that society because conceptually, science has been written out of their mind. I mean, the analogy I gave about if Muslims are a human body, then the mind, which is the science, has been taken out. And so the mind has to come back to some extent, and that requires reconceptualizing of Islam itself. It's not something that you can only do in terms of science.
Philip Campbell from Nature. There are 57 countries that describe themselves as Muslim countries, and I wondered whether there are, I mean, the flavor of your talk was very much oriented towards Middle Eastern countries. I wondered if you wanted to mention whether Malaysia or perhaps Turkey, which I think are scientifically active and developed, whether you see them as examples to other countries, and whether you take optimism from what you see in any of the 57 countries.
Well, I see optimism, but I take my optimism wherever I get. I mean, if you're looking at the Muslim world, there's not much optimism to be had. So I grab it from wherever I can. No, I disagree. I was not focused. I was focused on Islam as a whole rather than as Arab world. It's simply because the Arab Human Development Report concentrates on the Arab world. I think some of the most exciting things, both in terms of rethinking Islam and in terms of science, are happening on the periphery, in Turkey, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, and in Morocco and places like that. I was in Indonesia about six months ago, where I was actually attending a talk, or giving a talk on rethinking Islam. And I presented the argument that you need science at the core to actually achieve that. And the whole discussion turned into a discussion of science, rather than Islam, because everybody was very eager and they understood my argument, exactly what I was saying, in a sense, and they were very, very excited. And I think some of the senior scientists at OIC level also see this, that in fact, if they are going to get their communities involved in science, if they're going to generate interest in science, they have to present it in a conceptual way.
Question over there.
Thanks. My name's Daniel Friesner. You did say that it wasn't enough just to eulogize a list of achievements, but still there's something I've noticed in recent very laudable attempts to tell people about past achievements of Islamic science, which is to simplify the achievements and give it as a sort of list of correct things that were discovered, like a recent TV documentary which just stated baldly that Alhazen was the first person to discover how we see, which is a great oversimplification. And I think you may have slightly fallen into this yourself. If I heard you correctly, you said that Alhazen had given a correct explanation of the moon illusion, which he gave a very interesting explanation, but I mean, scientists still haven't settled on the final correct explanation. Now, it seems to me when we talk about Greek science, we don't feel the need to talk in this way. Everybody knows that Ptolemy and Euclid made great contributions to optics, even though their theories were wrong. And could we try and talk about Islamic science in the same way?
I agree with you. I agree with you 100%. If I am guilty of this sin, then I apologize. I did not set out to actually do that. What I wanted to do is to convey some of the flavor of the work that the Muslim scientists did, and that's why I said, he measured, he produced a map of the world, or he did this and whatever. So basically, what I wanted to do is to convey the scientific nature of the work and to show that it was real science, right? It was not alchemy or occult or some other nonsense that some. I nearly mentioned a name which I should not mention, but that some followers of a great philosopher and historians of Islamic science insist that Islamic science was all very sacred and it was all done in a very weird and strange way. That was my intention. So I apologize if I think overstating the case is very, very common in Muslim societies when they talk of Islamic science and history.
There are lots more questions. I think we take them two at a time. So could we have gentlemen there, and then gentlemen 4 rows back there.
Neil Banot. As I understand it, Sufism, it has Vedic roots from the subcontinent, and actually that was a very free religion. And, it's somehow later on it got confined into Mohammedanism, as I would call it, in the Quran. And then even to bring science into sort of this phrase of Islamic science, I think that itself is a weakness. Because for reason and debate, some of the authoritarian concepts of the Quran, they diminish. They are the ones that actually reduce the scientific progress. So I think perhaps we need to separate that the debate and reason elements from an Islamic way of life, which if there is authoritarianism there, somehow we need to challenge that. And just like the lady over there mentioned that there are atheists and there are humanists and so on who are also scientists. Now how will they challenge Islamic science if they are within that Islamic umbrella?
Let me start the last. Can I just briefly?
Okay.
They will challenge Islamic science, and basically by Islamic science I mean science that was produced in history, Islamic history. But never mind. They will challenge Islamic science as they challenge all other science by evidence and argument. And if there are authoritarian folks, then we should stand up to all authoritarian folks, including in Vedic thought and Indian philosophy and so on and so forth. I am intrinsically anti-authoritarian. I stand up to. I do not accept any authority. Now, the interesting point here is this, that within the Islamic view of rationality, as I understand it, you cannot invoke argument from absolute authority. So if you look at the work of, say, Ibn Haytham, or Al-Bruni that I've been talking about, when they're presenting their argument, they say, the evidence for this is this, right? The empirical evidence for this is that. They never say, and finally, God says so. Now, that God says so does not exist in that frame of reference. The argument of from absolute authority cannot be invoked, and that's why I'm against creationism. I'm an evolutionist and a Muslim, and I don't see any problem with that at all. Now, the final point about the Quran, I think, is that you've simply been reading the different thing than I have. So let us agree to disagree. Maybe you need to go back and read it properly.
Next question there.
Thank you very much. Subi al-Azawi, Foundations for Science, Technology and Civilization. I wonder if I could make the point that the difference between then, and I mean the 8th century, and now, is that in the 7th to 9th century, particularly in Baghdad, we had the caliph who was a member of the intellectual elite who used to actually chair discussions of scientists, of poetry, of anything. And he used to provide the money for research as well, and used to actually pay them as awards. Nowadays, unfortunately, our rulers in the Muslim countries are afraid of science. They are afraid of new thoughts. They are afraid of an intellectual idea. And they haven't got the power to fight an intellectual idea with another intellectual idea. Therefore, they use suppression. And I think that is one of the reasons why we are behind. If I may add one thing, because that is related to our science, technology, and civilization, we have published the book 1001 Inventions. And the reason for that is to inspire the Muslim youth in the West, to tell them that there have been Islamic science, technology, and civilizations and thoughts because they are unable to read about them in the Western universities. And that is the reason for it. But it really is to act as an inspiration rather than an end in itself. Thank you very much.
I agree.
Yes. Questions? One there and one back there. Yes.
Hello, yes. My name is Jerry Revets, and I want us to consider whether the term science could be thought about again, and that might help to solve your problems. very, very briefly, it could be that just now the idea of science, certainly here in this country, is changing very quickly into being something no longer just an elitist activity of clever people who discover wonderful things. It is now becoming seen as integrally a social and ethical pursuit. And that's something I think that Islam could catch on to.
May I say, this is Jerry Davids, my mentor and great friend, and he taught me all the science and history and science and philosophy I know.
Yes, yes. Let's take some questions from the further near the back there. Yeah. Yes.
Let's take this
right. Yes. And then one over there. Then there. Can we take 3 questions quickly, because we're running out of time? So 3 short questions.
Abdul Salam, yes. Thanks, Zia, for a very informative and enjoyable lecture. I have 3 short questions.
No, can you please ask just one question?
The first one, you seem to link the Islamic culture as a whole with the science problem. Now, there have been a number of secular Muslim countries like Turkey, Egypt, for a while. They have not, it cannot be the influence of Islamic culture on these countries unless you are looking at it. So why do you think these countries have this problem? Secondly...
Thank you very much. Can we cut to other people? Thank you.
It's an important point.
Okay, can we move on, please?
Okay. We can talk to this.
Yes. Right. Anyone got a microphone? Yes. Yes, okay, yes.
My name is Shams Zaman. I'm from medical science background, but retired now. I very much enjoyed your well-researched work, and I want to congratulate you on that. But the problem is, at this moment, many Muslim youths who are living in this Western civilization, Western society, still have not developed that idea that science and Islam, they are the same thing. Science is a part of Islam, arts is a part of Islam, philosophy is a part of Islam. Islam means way of life and the knowledge. So what do you think, how do you think they can be initiated in this manner?
Would you like to answer those 2 questions?
The first one I even forgotten. I think it was 1/3 of a very complicated question, which I kind of know what it is. Let me start with the second question, which I think is very, very important. I think the Muslim youth in Britain have a very truncated notion of Islam. Not all of them, but I think overall majority of them. However, they do have, some of them do have kind of passion for learning about Islam. And they do have passion for learning about Islamic history. The 1001 exhibition that was mentioned, it came out of that particular passion. But from my point of view, the problem is that the science that they study at school does not make any connection to their own particular history. If textbooks in British schools had some notion that science did not start with in the 15th century in Europe, that science, that other cultures and civilizations have also made serious contribution to science, and sure that science grows by accumulation, by building on the works of previous scientists. If we could have that kind of curricula at the school, I think it will have a profound impact on Muslim youth, and it will kind of get them interested not just in Islam, but more important, it will get them interested in science.
Can we have 2 more questions? One from the gentleman there, one from the lady there. And I'm afraid that'll have to be the last questions. I'm sorry.
My name's John Hunter. I was just wondering, just as Darwin with his theory of evolution sort of seemed to undermine parts of the Bible, I'm wondering whether Islamic scientists could do the same thing, whether they'd be allowed to, if they found certain things that undermine the Quran, whether that would be acceptable.
You know, the problem for us is other way around. is that most of our Muslim scholars are finding things in science that they think exist in the Quran. So we have a totally reverse problem. It's not, I mean, you see, the Quran is not, it's not like Bible in the sense that, you know, there's a chapter on Genesis and God created earth, and, you know, it's much more metaphorical, it's much more observational in the sense, go out and see. So when people read the Quran, and a certain type of Muslims read the Quran, and they also happen to have a scientific background, and some of them are PT kind of, you know, high-level professors, and I think one or two people I know are even members of the Fellows of the Royal Society. They actually see science in the Quran as though it was a textbook of science. And if you go around in any Islamic bookshop in London, Birmingham, Manchester, you can pick up numerous books from the shelf in the Islamic bookshop, which talk about how relativity has been discovered in the Quran, or how there's a whole book called Geology of the Quran, and I swear it's that thick, right? And it's been written by a man who is a world-renowned geologist, right? Who's published serious geological work. And Geology of the Quran is that thick, arguing verse after verse, showing a bit like Newton and his you know, biblical chronology stuff. So our problem is totally the reverse. So that's why the whole creationism and intelligent design debate that is now emerging in the Muslim world, and it's becoming quite big, I find that mind-bogglingly complex. We should be intrinsically pro-evolution. That we are into creationism is very, very odd. I mean, anybody who has read Life of Pi knows that this is basically a treatise on evolution. You know, the hero comes out of the sea, spontaneously degenerates himself and evolves into a human being. And you see he's describing the process of his evolution. And then he starts wandering about on this island. Now, if this is not an evolutionary book, I don't know what it is. And it was written in the 12th century. So we should be intrinsically pro-evolution.
Last question there.
My name is Golzar Alavi. Firstly, I want to thank you for your lovely lecture. It was very informative. Also, to a question that a lady just mentioned earlier about how we can make the youth, Muslim youth, more aware that Islam and Islam and science are the same thing, and how we can sort of close that boundary. I personally practice Sufism. And I would think that it's a very scientific way, and it encourages you to actually go beyond the boundaries of physical body. You study the science and the metaphysical side, obviously. It teaches you that Islam, or any other religion, the essence is the same. And there's no differences between a Muslim or a Christian or a Jew, because we're all from the same source. And obviously encourages science in the physical matter. I just wanted to say that. Thank you.
Oh, well, I don't know how to react to that, but I ought to tell you very clearly and directly, Sufism and science are two different things, and there's no relationship between the two. Science requires you to go into a laboratory. Sufism requires you to follow a sheikh. I have a great respect for Sufism. I have many, you know, I've had a mystical experience myself, to be quite honest, but science is not Sufism. It's something totally different. It is an empirically based, evidence-based, systematic way of studying the material universe. It has nothing to do with, I mean, you may get mystical by writing certain equations, but that's a different thing altogether.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we clearly have gone on a very long time with questions, because this lecture deals with a topic which is as high as any on the agenda in our contemporary world, whether we like it or not. And I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking Professor Sardar for his eloquent analysis of the issue. Thank you very much.